the rock of Precipitation and Tiberias. One morning there was a market held in an open space adjoining the threshing floor. How different was this market held at Nazareth from the markets held in Dorchester every Wednesday, and yet we heard the same lowing and bleating of the constrained beasts. The stockmen stood about in their native dress, some by their animals, others in group, and I saw many a tall, fox-faced man, turbaned and cloaking, chaffering over a camel or bob-tailed mule. The sheep and goats all had the same lop ears, like hutched rabbits. Many of the asses seemed too small to be used by men, and yet I saw a colt no higher than a greyhound struck over the head, for nothing. Every Arab wore long, ugly spurs with which to tear the belly flesh of the horses, so wonderfully caparisoned with tassels. These men will not tolerate any display of wilfulness in the animal world. They will soon see to it. Often I have watched them jerking at the mouths of their horses with cruel bits, holding them in and at the same time thrashing them. We saw several groups of camels lying on the ground like large dusty packs. Some of the teeth of the old ones looked green. By climbing over a bank at the further end of the market square it was possible to get onto the open hills, and this we did, intending to walk to Jebel el-Kafsar, or the Mountain of the Leap. Our way led us along the side of a rocky valley in the centre of which 3 black tents were pitched. There were larks in the sky, and wheat ears flitted before us. We were climbing up to the top of the escarpment overlooking the valley of Esdraelon. Our advance was obstructed by grey boulders crouched close together like giant ossified toads. In an ecstasy I let my hands trace their crinkled surfaces. Once I saw the little owl of Pallas Athene blinking at me. We stood watching it, but it never flew away. When we reached the edge of the precipice we were able to look sheer down upon the celebrated plain. The ploughed lands below, with their furrows often running in opposite directions, suggested the warp and woof of some rough, russet-coloured homespun carpet. In the furthest distance we could see the hills of Judea. Across the plain ran a straight road, the road to Jerusalem. Mount Tabor was to the east of us, in shape resembling hedgecock. Some yoked oxen were ploughing on a plot below, small and slow as dung beetles. Between the rocks where we were standing were pans of shallow oil, and in some of these we found shallow soil, and in some of these we found autumn crocuses, or naked nannies out in flower. And also as we were returning I found a jet-black lord and lady. Its texture was velvet to the touch, and it was as black as a folded bat's wing. I picked it, then threw it away, but after I had gone a few steps came back to look for it, and have it in my prayer book still. We returned between the 2 hills of Our Lady of the Fright, crossing near the valley I had noticed from the feller's garden. This led us to the market square again, where I saw an ass eating a cactus, hard spikes and all, with the greatest relish. The drive to Tiberias took us past Cana of Galilee, which is within easy walking distance of Nazareth. Fresh water flowed there, again under cactuses. These extraordinary plants must have been introduced into the country long after scriptural time, or they would have been mentioned in the Bible. Yet how indigenous they look now. Brown and arid enough the plain appeared that led to the Horns of Hattin. As we drove, numberless, little birds rose from the soil on each side of the way. The hills and slopes looked waterless and parched. And then suddenly far below us we saw it, the Lake of Galilee. I never had imagined anything more blue, more fresh than this pool of water so shut away, so sheltered in the cup of the hills. The blue water lay in the lap of blue hills under the blue sky. I could see where the river Jordan entered the lake, and could also see where it flowed out in the misty distance. Both entrance and exit were bright green in colour. The length of the lake, as far as I could judge, was equal to the distance from Lulworth Cove to Weymouth, its breadth about the same distance as from the White Nose to Portland. It lies many feet below sea level. We drank a cup of tea at the inn where we were lodging, but our pleasure in it was marred by discovering the countless ants of an infinitesimal size that were present in the sugar, in the honey, and on the toast. We summoned a servant, but his efforts availed little. When we thought they had been brushed away, we still found others. It was almost dark when we went down to the native quarter. When I looked up in the narrow streets, I could see the sky splashed with red and yellow against the spreading leaves of palms which, far above the roofs, swayed to and fro in the breeze of the oncoming night. I could hear the sound of their dry surfaces scraping against each other. The noise they made was different from the wind on the naked thorn trees on the downs, or the lashing whistle the leafless elders give in winter storms when they are bent to the ground like praying men. At one place I noticed an enormous carved stone let into a wall. The scene that the chisel had depicted was of a rampant lion about to leap on a man. It was a relic, so I discovered afterward, of the original city built by Herod Antipas. Built, so it has always been rumoured, over the bones of dead Jews. This single stone certainly suggested the brutal gusto of heathen Rome. Small wonder, I thought, that Jesus shunned the city, never probably setting foot in it. He must have seen its lights often enough, must have heard it described by the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward, but never, not even in St. Peter's fishing boat, have come near to it. I dare say it is not much altered from what it was. The streets today are still narrow and crowded. It was like finding one's way through a rat warren. We passed many Jews with curled locks. The outsides of the houses were coloured with a kind of blue wash. My purpose was to get down on the shore of the lake, but though I could often see the water, I found each narrow alley entrance barricaded by iron railings. A strange resonance, as from innumerable flies, rose from between the houses, and as we climbed each slippery alley stairway, our noses were assailed by aromatic oriental perfumes mingled with the sweet, unmistakable smell of ordure. Eventually we emerged at the south end of the town. It was possible here to reach the very shore of the lake. This we did and sat side by side near the lake, water, on large, smooth pebbles. It was very still there in the darkness. Tiny sideway ripples broke against the stones. They would have been hardly strong enough to overturn the hollow shell of a garden snail. At intervals we heard the pattering of donkeys going down the road behind us. Once we were disturbed by footsteps on the beach. It was a woman, bucket in hand, coming to fetch water. For age upon age, what a boon to the dry land of Palestine must this reservoir of fresh drinking water have been. Pygarchs had slaked their hearts' tongues in it. Jesus had let it run through his fingers, had held it in the cup of his hand, had drunk of it. Gradually it grew lighter. We could now see individual ripples 100 yards away. We realized that the moon was coming up from behind the hills opposite. First we saw a tiny shining rim, a morsel of radiance upon the dark mass of shadow. Then minute by minute the satellite revealed herself in all her loveliness, and rose, unravished as ever, fresh and treacherous over Asia. The next morning we hired 2 Arab fishermen to take us to the north end of the lake. They stood up to row. I lay in the narrow stern of the boat, my head just above the gunwale. The mountains behind Capernaum, falling away from the horns of Hattin, glowed pink in the morning sun. The hills on the east of the lake, about Gargasa, stood sombre and sunless. These escarpments made a dark wall above the water. They possessed wide undercliffs with sandy, water-worn drifts. It was there that the maniac, who called himself Legion, had his haunts. It was there that Jesus used to walk, free from the crowds, watching to distinguish the boats of his friends, toiling and rowing, while he strengthened his soul with his mystical meditations, alone on the land. It is odd to think how familiar the boats of his disciples must have been to him. Zebedee's boat and Peter's boat, each of them with its particular timber identity able to be recognised from a far distance, to be recognised by the shape of its bows where the brown nets were used to be piled, to be recognised by the colour of its sails. When he was on board, we would know by the frayed rowlocks in which of them he was, or by the amount of water washing backward and forward between the planks that lay over the kelson. In such moments he would be reminded of the unaltering reality about him. He would think of these boats when he was preaching under fly-pestered eastern arches. Even after he had been disputing with the Sadducees in the temple at Jerusalem, if any of his disciples, as they sat resting before the treasury, had in their casual talk made reference to one or other of these small workaday craft, he would have known without looking up which of them it was. Often I trailed my fingers in the water. Its surface was indented with tiny cupped ripples like the depressions of beaten metal. Close at hand the water was green in colour, but further away it was blue. I was astonished by the amount of bird life on the lake. I saw gulls and divers and ducks and cormorants. I kept looking back over the dazzling water to where the walls and turret towers of Tiberias were growing smaller and smaller in the distance. We landed a little to the eastward of where the Jordan flows into the lake. There is a level plain here between the hills and the sea, a plain that has probably been formed out of the sand and silt washed down by the river, and which possibly was hardly in existence when Jesus led the blind man outside the village of Bethsaida to restore his sight among heaps of litter and broken potsherds. We crossed over the foreshore of drab sand till we reached a higher level of green grass, and here we passed some inland water where buffaloes were wallowing, occasionally giving utterance to gruff bellows. I did not care for the look of some of them as they turned their heads in our direction. However, I was reassured by seeing a herdsman in the distance. There was much scrub about. We saw some Bedouin tents and made our way toward them. 3 elderly Arabs were drinking coffee, the pot left to boil upon a fire of camel's dung. They were very friendly to us, and though we could not understand a word they said, we were content to be their guests. How cool it was under the tent. I sat at the end of a charred log, making friendly gestures to these men, who regarded us with sly glances of amicable detachment. Through the door of the tent I could see a camel standing perfectly motionless among some sunlit rushes. Beyond was a bush of flowering oleanders, and beyond again the lake and sky. When we rose to go, I put out my hand and touched the goat hair awning. It felt rough to my fingers, like heavy fibre matting, each individual hair distinct. From a distance the tents appeared black as night, as though they were stretched out wings of crouching devils. On our way back we passed a naked fisherman standing in the middle of a pool, not much larger than the Abbey pond. His fish basket about his waist was all the covering he had. His legs were shiny with grey mud. A little further we disturbed a crane, concentrated upon the same occupation. A picture book, gralatorial bird with black tail and wings, white head, neck and breast. We loitered, picking up shells. Little white shells that might have been dropped from the flat foreheads of a species of unicorn no bigger than locusts. We now told the men that row us to the mouth of the Jordan. I got out and, rolling my trousers as high up my thighs as possible, waded across it, my father's stick in my hand. I saw many white and black divers at the river's mouth, poising themselves with flickering balance before darting with a sudden drop into the water. I also saw kingfishers sitting motionless on stones. We followed along the bank of the river. I would have liked nothing better than to trace its course up to the waters of Merom. It was not much wider than the Yeo, for what I could see of it. It contained deep pools under overhanging willows, pools in which you would have expected to find great lubberly lobworm-eating roach. We came to a bend where there was an expanse of deep water. It was here that I watched a tortoise swimming along under an overgrown bank. We saw an encampment of Bedouin tents. While we were still far off, some 20 dogs came rushing out at us. I never saw such infuriated animals, yet they kept their distance, whether intimidated by my father's walking stick, presented to him by the Montecute church choir, or by my feigned gestures of picking up stones, I could not tell. I was glad enough when a man approached us and they slunk off. When we got back to the mouth of the Jordan, we found one of our boatmen talking to a fisherman who was showing him a fish he had just caught. I examined it curiously. It was a muscular and stiff-necked fish to handle, not unlike a catfish, but with tight, snake-like scales and lemon-coloured belly fins. It uttered odd noises when I held it. Perhaps it belonged to the species Corachinus, described by Josephus as being capable of emitting sounds. Perhaps it could hear as well as speak. Perhaps its ancestors, holding their heads near the surface water of the lake, had often listened to the voice of Jesus, telling his simple, poetic stories to the crowd on the shore. His intonation so different from the clamour made by the ordinary fishermen as at night time they bawled at each other from their lighted boats. That evening we ate the fish, Chromis simonus. It was dainty tasting. I understand it is only found here and in Lake Tanganyika. Another day we hired the same boat and rowed to Capernaum. We reached the shadow of the trees at noon. It was blazing hot. I saw here a kingfisher larger than I have ever known, of the brightest blue. There was a Franciscan hospice with one monk in residence. We went into the guest room, and presently an Arab caretaker appeared who told us that the priest was resting and could not be disturbed for 2 hours. We lay on some forms, waiting. When the man finally entered, he turned out to be a Spaniard. He was obviously a person of character, a practical man who had accepted his faith with unquestioning ardour. He spoke French, and I think he took a fancy to me. He showed us the ruins of the town. The synagogue, built for the Jews by the Roman centurion, was standing as it had been. Over the headstone of its door, a disfigured Roman eagle was still visible. Obviously an attempt had been made to deface it, probably by the Jews of antiquity in their hatred for graven images. The interior of the building was about the size of a village chapel. There were rows of stone seats along the walls for the elders to sit upon. In the centre was an open space. "There it is," said our guide. "There is the very place where Jesus stood when he cured the man who had a spirit of an unclean devil." He spoke with the exultation, as a pagan priest might have done who was showing you a spot of ground where Apollo had once stood. It was as though he had found here a practical, positive proof of the truth of all of the Christian doctrine, as if this parcel of dust encircled by white limestone clinched the argument for all time, leaving no more to be said. Truly I was impressed. I went about in the bright sunshine examining each monolithic shaft. Some of the Corinthian capitals were carved with the vine of Judah. There were also stones shaped to represent pots of manna. I stood at the top of the flight of steps which St. Sylvia makes record of. They rose from the village street and were of cut stone. How often must Jesus have stood at the top of them, knowing himself to be an alien among the humdrum, everyday provincial rabbis? How often he must have loitered here as he went out slowly from the synagogue, catching glimpses of the lake between the walls of the houses, marking the backs of his grave compatriots, returning to the homes past the house of Simon Peter's wife's mother, their minds full of thoughts of the nation's deliverance.